All right, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one and only V, the Grill Economist, coming to you live with my main man, not only CJ, but also London Paul. London Paul is joining us this morning on a special edition of this Sirius Report. And folks, if you haven't went on the SiriusReport.com, I advise you to go to the Sirius Report. That is spelled Sirius, Sirius, the SiriusReport.com. Become a member. Become a member for less than a price. And Starbucks is rolling out their summer drink. CJ, they have this thing called the Cascara Sagrada, some sort of iced cold brew latte schmate. For less than the price of a venti latte schmate, you can get a meaningful membership to the SiriusReport.com that will give you daily briefings from the man himself, London Paul. We love his work. We love his viewpoints. And folks, you want to know, you want to cut out the noise. You want some really good insight, some really thought-provoking pieces of data that Paul puts out the best way he knows how. You need to go, SiriusReport.com. With that out of the way, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Yeah, good morning,
How's
B.
that for an intro?
Fine. I know.
Paul, you have to admit, I give the best intros.
You do indeed. Do you know, I was saying to CJ before we came on, sometimes it's good to inject a bit of humour into everything, because I imagine people think we're really dour individuals who sit there all day, doom and gloom or, whatever, but we're not. Very different people off air. And sometimes, it's good to inject a bit of humour into things, because it is pretty serious stuff we discuss, and therefore, So I appreciate the fact a bit of humour now and again. It does lighten the load somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely correct. Paul, what do you want to target, man?
Let's do this. Yeah. Aside from that, of course, we immediately jump into... I heard yesterday that, obviously we're aware that the OPCW visited the site in Damascus, which was the subject of, this fake chemical weapons attack in Douma, to collect samples. But what I heard yesterday was that the OPCW had said that there was no chemical weapons found at the Basay Research Center in Damascus, unsurprisingly. But now the OPCW have come out today and said, no, there isn't. So, of course, we knew this was the case anyway, because, frankly, if you'd blown up a chemical weapons research facility, there would have been a lot of very dead people over a very large area. So it was obvious. The damaging aspect is, well, who provided the intelligence to the US, the UK, and France to suggest it was the case, and why did they buy it? And secondly, it rather rubbishes all these convoluted conspiracy theories that, in fact, they were taking out cabal centers in Syria. Absolutely not. The very sad fact is that Basay Research Center was actually for pharmaceutical development, and they were doing extensive research into anti-cancer drugs. So well done, Western nations, for blowing up a facility that was actually trying to do some good for the world. Very intelligent behavior. I mean, whether there's any follow-up on this remains to be seen, but there's going to now cast serious doubts on Western intelligence. And the problem is, in the future, what happens if there is a legitimate concern somewhere in the world? People are going to say, well, hang on, you said this last time. We don't trust your judgment anymore. So it's like, it's crying wolf once too often. And I suspect, while we knew in reality it wasn't the case, the OPCW coming out and stating the fact is a very, very different matter. So it remains to be seen what the fallout is. But the argument's now going to be, well, you claim there was chemical weapons in this research center that wasn't.
Right.
So how about all these other facilities that you keep claiming are chemical weapons, and that chemical weapon attacks have happened? It's going to put some serious doubt. Those nations who have backed the US, the UK, and France in the process are going to be looking to save face, and the nations who said we're not backing you are going to be vindicated. And of course, it vindicates what the Russians have said, vindicates what the Syrians have said. And it's a completely embarrassing debacle, again, on top of every other embarrassing debacle that the West ever gets involved in.
Yeah, no, it really is. I mean, everything is in the whole entire narrative of the gas attack in Duma is something that's literally falling apart at the wheels. It had no traction, Paul. They couldn't get that plane off the ground before it fell apart.
Yeah, I mean, and in a way, it's a good thing that the narrative does collapse and fall apart, because it raises people's understanding in the West exactly what the reality is of practically every military incursion that the West has done since, well, World War II is on bogus pretexts. So it's good in that sense. Fortunately, nobody was killed in Syria as a result of these missile attacks, which we've covered off, and we won't bother going into that again. But suffice to say that the West is still reeling over the fact that they now are absolutely sitting ducks and they have no answer to Russian military technology. And we could then, in a way, that feeds on, because we can go and start to sort of discuss Iran and Macron and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, in a way, in essence, a trap was set. And because if you look at the reality, weeks before this chemical weapons attack happened, Russia was telegraphing it, telling the world, we have intelligence that suggests they're going to try and launch a chemical attack in that region, not specifically in Duma, but in that region. They telegraphed it for weeks. They warned effectively whoever was responsible, directly and indirectly, we're aware of it, we know you're going to do it. What did they do? They still did it. That was the trap. They fell into the trap. They still did it. And now the whole fallout is beginning to come, the chickens are coming home to roost. Basically, in terms of what the OPCW have said about the research centre, now it remains to be seen what the OPCW says with regards to samples they've collected in Duma itself. But if, for argument's sake, they come out and say there was no chemical weapons attack, well, the whole thing has utterly collapsed. As I say, Russia and China are very happy to lay traps. They'll continue to do so, and whoever's responsible continues to fall into it with devastating consequences. Yeah. In a way, good that they are being exposed for what they are. And as we say, fortunately, no one in Syria died as a result of these missile attacks, but that was largely due to Russian military technology, which prevented it happening. If they'd actually struck all their targets and the Navy destroyers had managed to launch missiles, it would have been devastating for the Syrian people, devastating for Assad, and also a huge boost for the militants in trying to reclaim parts of Syria. It would have been devastating. Fortunately, none of that's happened, but the OPCW update this morning is now should be raising serious questions across the entire world as to, well, where the hell do you get your intelligence from? And in the process, why, therefore, did you, because you said that you were merely launching these attacks to blunt Assad's chemical weapons capability. We know he doesn't have any. Well, this proves that's just utter nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely correct.
So, yeah. But, yeah, I think Iran's something we need to kind of discuss for a bunch of reasons. Now, there's talk in various sections of, well, someone brought it to my attention, to be honest, saying that there's talk in sections of the old media that somehow Iran's part of some plan and they're next on the list. Well, if there's any plans next on the list for Iran involving regime change, that's a cabal plan. They've been trying to do it for decades. They were meddling in the early 2000s. They were meddling at some point during the Bush administration, where they left weapons on the Iranian border and told the Iranians to launch them at the Iraqis, and the Iranians said, "You must be joking," and didn't do it. So this has been going on for a long time. So there is no grand Western plan to have regime change in Iran. It would be catastrophic for that to happen. Now, obviously, we've got the 12th of May coming up, with where Trump's supposed to set this deadline for the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal.
Right.
And there's a lot of speculation as to what he intends doing or doesn't intend doing. I mean, there's obviously three sort of schools of thought. Either he doesn't do anything, either they decide to implement more sanctions, or they just completely walk away from the JCPOA. Now, from the Europeans' perspective, that's they don't want the US to walk away from the JCPOA because it means then effectively the Europeans have been trying to sort of get into the Iranian markets and have some strong bilateral trade agreements with them. If the US walks away, then they feel, well, we're just going to have to walk away and we're going to lose all that potential business. And in the process, they'll hand it all to the Russians and the Chinese anyway, which the Russian, and this is why we've had this big move for the Iranians to join the EAEU. And that's very quickly. They've jumped through hoops in the Russian parliament to make this happen. They've announced they're de-dollarizing and going to use the euro, but bear in mind they're already using the ruble and the yuan anyway to trade with Russia and China. Then we had the goods for oil agreement between that is now being sort of rubber stamped, and it started to happen. This is all moves telegraphed because the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese know that Trump sat there going, well, what am I going to do with regards to the JCPOA? How am I going to handle this particular situation? So therefore, they're already circumventing that problem. Yeah. The other problems you have in the Middle East, and it was a bit concerning to hear some of Trump's comments because, yeah, he's kind of backtracking from the idea they're going to withdraw US troops from Syria, because he made the flaw of saying it's important not to allow Iranian influence to grow in the country. Well, no surprise where those comments came from. And he says that the US wants to leave a strong and lasting footprint in the country. Well, that doesn't sound too great if you're Syria.
That's never going to happen. That's a pipe dream.
No, it's a pipe dream. No. And then he says, but he also said we don't want to give Iran open seas into the Mediterranean. Well, we've talked about all that before.
Yeah, that's a Saudi. That's a Saudi and Israeli wish right there.
Yes, exactly. But he did make some comment where he said we've finished part of our work with respect to ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and we've done a job that no one else has been able to do. So I'm not quite sure what job Trump thinks the US has been doing and its coalition allies, but they certainly haven't been doing the job that the Russians have been doing.
Yeah, not even close. I mean, if anything, they've been making things up.
And of course, the whole point of the US withdrawal all comes back to the fact that when they made the announcement, Israel went into a tailspin because they think, well, if the US withdraws, then the Iranians are just going to grab more than a foothold in Syria, and they're worried they'll set up bases and they'll attack Israel, which of course is never going to happen. But that's the paranoia that exists inside Israel, and yet, and the US has said, well, it supports Israel's efforts to thwart Iranian expansionism, but I think Israel's terrified that the Washington's basically ceding that arena in Syria to Russia and ultimately Iran and Assad, and then of course we come back to the fact that now the rhetoric's getting pretty high. I think one of the sort of major generals in the Iranian army has said, we're going to ensure this arrogant system will collapse, i.e. Israel, and they'll be annihilated. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard have warned Israel that its air bases are within reach, and they've got nowhere to run except to fall into the sea. Okay, this is all high octane rhetoric, but interestingly, I'm more interested in what the Israelis have said, and they said, they've warned Tehran not to attack Israel. Well, I don't think any for one reason they will, but they said we've never been better prepared to counter Iran. Well, that is an indication it's exactly the opposite. The biggest dagger to the heart of Israel is the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry is now saying we're going to arm Syria with advanced S-300 defense systems, and they said this now brings Israeli and Lebanese airspace to within targeting range of Syrian missiles. So what they're effectively saying is, if you're going to we gave you some latitude if you kept out of Syrian airspace, but if you're going to start launching attacks from Lebanese airspace that you have done into Syria, well, maybe with the S-300s, once they're delivered and implemented, that therefore means they're in range to attack those as well. And of course, the Israelis have come out and said they're going to attack the S-300s if Russia moves forward on supplying them. Well, bearing in mind the Russians operate, so what are they going to do? Start going into a hot war with Russia inside Syria? Absolutely not. And the thing is, though, what was interesting is that we always had this attitude where Russia and Israel have this kind of diplomatic relationship. And yes, it has existed, but we spoke several months ago and maybe beyond that, how that's changed. And it absolutely changed when the US coalition strike happened on the 13th of April, because immediately the Russians said, well, we're going to reconsider now whether we supply air defenses to Assad, because basically what happened is in 2013, Putin talked then about giving the S-300s to Syria, and Netanyahu said, look, I don't want you to do it. And Russia went, okay, well, under those circumstances, we'll back off from it, and we won't do it. 2018, it's a very different matter now. And of course, with the S-300s, what they're now saying as well is that Assad can even lock onto the Israeli Air Force aircraft as they take off from bases within Israel. So Israel's naturally very concerned about this. Of course, the S-300s would hamper their ability to attack military targets in Syria, and therefore it just feeds more into their fear about what Iran might do.
Right.
And all of a sudden now the Israeli Air Force don't really have the freedom of skies other than in Israel itself. But I think the most telling comment was that Russian military have stated that if Israel tries to destroy S-300s, S-200s or anything, it will lead to catastrophic consequences. Well, it didn't even say grave consequences. It's up the rhetoric and now saying it's catastrophic consequences. That suggests that the Russians would respond militarily and launch attacks at Israeli aircraft. And who knows, maybe they'll even go further than that and launch attacks on Israel itself. I'm not saying that'll happen, but catastrophic sounds pretty serious in any language. So I think this is a big problem. But once again, it's part of the trap, because who set the whole ball rolling on the April the 9th was when, I mean, Israel still haven't admitted responsibility, but the Russians know that they struck the T4 air base in Syria, and where Iran was supposed to have had this, fully functional air base on its own, and that's why the Israelis attacked it. Well, it's not the case, but we know that a number of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed in that strike. That deeply angered not only the Iranians, and it was a deliberate provocation to try and get the Iranians to respond, who didn't respond. And then what do we find 4 days later? Then we've got the missile attack coming from the Western coalition forces. It was ultimately Israel's fallen into this trap as well as whoever else was involved. I don't like to label governments, because governments, I don't believe for 1 minute Trump would have launched a missile attack knowing what we've just discussed now. And people say, well, how did he not know this if we knew it? But we've gone through this before. Being the president of the US is a very different matter, and who knows what intelligence was put before him. And I think the same can be said for Macron and May. They're not, if it may seem incredible to suggest this is the case, but I absolutely believe that how often nations have been told to go to war or to get involved in situations and then realized, in fact, they were being duped and lied to. And so sometimes it's difficult. As we know, Western governments, I don't put Trump in this category, they're just subservient to their paymasters and the people who run governments, as we know. Trump broke the mold in that regard. Okay, he's been struggling for 18 months to assert himself, but basically Western governments are like that. They just have subservient puppets to cabal who do what they're told, and they believe what they're told. And to give an example, David Cameron's a great example of this. When he was elected in 2010, he genuinely thought he could affect change. And within about a week or two, he realized that was never going to happen. There's a lot of illusion in terms of people going into politics thinking they can really affect change in the past. And I don't doubt the story about Cameron's true. It doesn't mean whatever the reality of Cameron as a person is, that's just a statement of fact that came out at the time. So it's very difficult to apportion blame. So when I refer to, U.S. coalition forces attacking the Syrians. We have to be careful who we're referring to. And I certainly think enormous amounts of credit needs to go to the U.S. military, who prevented things being a lot worse, what could have happened in Syria than did happen, simply because there was doubts expressed by Mattis to do with the whole chemical weapon attack, and also because the U.S. military knows full well that the Russian military has superior technology, because they can observe these things. They know the Russians have tested missiles, and they've seen technology that the Russians have showcased effectively in Syria, and it terrified them. I mean, they have energy weapons that can vaporize tanks in a blink of an eye, and there's literally this little ball of metal at the end of it. They've seen this happen. So the US military are fully aware of why they didn't want to overstep the mark in terms of what happened in Syria.
The whole entire thing with what's going on with Syria is really turning out to be a mess. And I think the faster the U.S. Rips the Band-Aid off that situation, the better off it will be. Switching gears real quick.
Yeah,
Paul.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. They just need to walk away. They need to get out of there, leave, go, and just get out the ugly mess, and leave whoever to if Israel wants to fight a war on its own, leave them to it. Just let them get on with it. And I don't think for 1 minute, if they think they're on their own, they would even do so. I mean, right. I don't think for 1 minute that would be the case. I think they're relying on the likes of Saudi, and they're relying on the likes of the US to buffer them, and without that support, I mean, it's interesting. We could talk about the Saudis and Trump and the whole Macron visit. There's some things worth discussing about that, which we can come to in a minute. But yeah, I don't think they would venture into, particularly not against the Russians. I mean, now the Russians have effectively said catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
If that doesn't put fear into them, I don't know what will. So,
yeah.
Because I mean, grave consequences is and catastrophic is an entirely different matter. But yeah, I think it's worth talking a bit about. Forget the pomp and ceremony with Trump and Macron, and I mean, there was this. I'm not sure he was trying to win the handshake between the two of them, because Trump does that thing when he grabs someone's hand, and you kind of get the feeling Macron was trying to do the same thing, but
the whole thing with I mean, can anybody take a tough French man seriously, Paul? I mean.
Well, Macron. The weird thing is, Macron. He started to make overtures. Yeah,
it's an oxymoron.
Yes. I mean, I think the truth is, I'm not sure how. If you strip all the pomp and ceremony away, how much Trump really takes Macron seriously, or what he thinks. But we'll discuss all the whole thing in a minute. But Macron is certainly, I think, in terms of Europe, he thinks Merkel's weak, and therefore he wants to try and usurp her as kind of not the leader of Europe, but the figurehead of Europe. And I think he thinks he can do that. The other point is, and we've discussed this before, Macron is deeply unpopular in France. His reforms have gone down like a lead balloon, and when the unions are against you, you've got big problems. And suddenly Macron goes and meets MBS, and then all of a sudden Macron becomes this kind of vulture in terms of French foreign policy, and how we're going to support strikes in Syria. Well, I mean, did the MBS meeting have anything to do with it? I suspect it probably did. Now, we know Trump and Macron apparently speak frequently on the phone, and of course they had this coordinated military strike on Syria. I mean, I suppose that suited Trump in one sense, because there was the Western support, and in the process, Macron's jumping on the coattails, going, "Oh, well, this is great. I can look like a forceful French leader in terms of French foreign policy.
I can be the next Charles de Gaulle, oui, oui."
Yeah, but of course the thing is, he only needs to reflect on what happened in Libya to realise where the French military incursions and foreign policy often leaves a lot to be desired. But the one thing, of course, between Macron and Trump is they disagree on a number of key issues. I mean, the strange thing is, I didn't realize he was Trump's first state dinner guest of honor was Macron, which seems extremely puzzling. And you can see Macron is trying to seek to win over Trump, even though Trump's really unpopular in France. I mean, I don't know who he's trying to appeal to, because for whatever reason, the French people don't really like Trump, and he tries to infer, we've got this great relationship between us, Trump and Macron, because he said both of us are probably maverick of the system on both sides. I'm not sure what sides he's referring to. But the thing is, of course, Macron's facing pressure to show that all this effort to cozy up to Trump and all this effort to, join in military action in Syria, what policy wins are there going to be for France? What does France get out of it? That's what the French people want to see. And he wants to boost his country's standing in Europe, and he's pushing this. I'm a prime defender of this liberal international order, precise thing that Trump denounces when he wants to make America great, and protectionism might be not quite the right word, but it's complete contradiction to Macron, who really doesn't want to see sovereign nations and believe that Europe should just be one great big country. And now the big thing is, and we touched on it earlier, is Macron wants to push Trump to make concessions on the nuclear. The Iran nuclear deal, and also the conflict in Syria, because he's desperate to convince the US to stay there. Well, no doubt MBS has tried to convince the Americans to stay there, and of course there's also the aspect of trade disputes, which we'll come on to shortly. But if he fails, Macron, to get anything out of this, he's just going to be under further criticism at home. Now, in terms of the Iran nuclear deal, as we touched on briefly earlier, the reality is France doesn't want the US to walk away from it, because economically it'd be very damaging to France. Look at Total and what they're doing in Iran, just for starters. And now, is he going to extend sanctions relief? Trump, it seems highly unlikely. And even Macron, at the close of his visit, basically said, "Well, I don't really think Trump's going to back down over the Iranian deal. I think he's likely to walk away from it." So Macron's already trying to soften the blow back home that he was somehow going to convince Trump to leave, to remain in the Iran nuclear deal. In terms of Syria, the US will leave when the US wants to leave, not because Macron's telling them to convince them to stay. And of course, he claimed he'd convinced Trump to stay, and then the Trump administration goes, "Well, actually, he didn't convince us to do anything." So again, now what we do know is that the US and the Europeans have been apparently having negotiations on trying to fix the deal, rather than just trashing the existing deal, but maybe add to it or create an addendum to it. And maybe economic sanctions is one way that means Trump doesn't have to lose face by doing nothing. But I mean, at the end of the day, the losers will be the US and the Europeans if they do that, because all it means is Russia and China will just get a bigger slice of the enormous economic pie that exists inside inside Iran. We know, never mind the fact that they're huge energy giants. Just look at the potential economic input that any nation can derive from a nation that's been sanctioned for 40 years and desperately needs investment. Now, the other thing from Macron's perspective is the whole tariff thing, because he's looking to try and seek this exemption from steel and aluminium tariffs that Trump announced last month. And apparently it's something I think Merkel, is it today or tomorrow? Merkel's due to visit Trump. I don't think she'll maybe getting a state dinner like Macron did after. Remember, the body language the last time they met in Washington was, it was you could say a pen could have dropped when you saw the tension between Merkel and Trump. But she's supposed to be pushing the issue of the tariffs as well. Well, maybe Trump will back off in that regard. But if he doesn't, then Macron ends up coming away with nothing. He might get nothing out of the Iranian nuclear deal, nothing out of tariffs, and the US isn't going to take any notice of him over Syria. You kind of get the feeling, in some respect, Macron thought, well, if we support the US in terms of military strike in in Syria. He may, bend to our will with regards to staying in Syria. But the other thing is, by all accounts, not a single French missile hit a target. I think they were all destroyed. So probably they'll deny that as well. But in a way, that's not a criticism of the French military per se, because none of the Western coalition forces struck a target. But it just proves that in reality, Macron is just trying to deflect away from his weakness at home and thinks he can jump on the coattails of Trump and persuade Trump to do a number of things. And there was even talk that he was trying to convince Trump to change his views on the Paris climate change agreement.
Macron is all of a sudden he's a super de Gaulle 2.0 over here.
So when you think what comes out of this, there's no real policy breakthroughs between the US and France. Yeah. So what's the whole visit? We've got this great friendship between the two leaders who ideologically couldn't be any separate in terms of their political and beliefs. So what's left? Oh, we've got these great... I think he got invited to Congress. The suggestion was it wasn't Trump who invited him to Congress, but it was Paul Ryan. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but there was some story floating around that was the case. But he mentioned about all these historic ties between the US and France as though, and as though that should be of any great substance. So is that all they've really got? We had these wonderful historic ties between the two nations, and that's the basis for a strong relationship going forward. And the problem is, economically, the issue as well has been that all the Russian sanctions, the continent who suffered more than anything has been Europe. The US actually didn't suffer much out of the Russian sanctions. Europe suffered more than anything. And the Russians bypassed most of it because they telegraphed what was coming down the line, rather like Iran is telegraphed the fact that Trump may impose more sanctions on Iran as a result of this nuclear deal come the 12th of May. And the other issue, of course, is if Trump does nothing, which I'm not sure that will be the case, but it remains to be seen, then there's going to be a lot of heat turned on him from Israel as to, well, why are you doing nothing to sanction the Iranians or rip up the nuclear deal? Although, interestingly, even Netanyahu's kind of backed off to a degree, because he's kind of said, well, we don't like the deal, but they're not. I think there was even an admission from the Israelis that, as everyone knows, that Iran's not in any way in breach of the JCPOA. They're doing everything they're supposed to do. Yeah, Trump might say it's a bad deal, and there might be aspects to it that aren't ideal, but you can't suggest ripping up a deal just because you don't like it. Otherwise, that just brings the whole idea of international agreements and treaties into complete disrepute. It remains to be seen what will happen in 16 days' time, but I would be surprised in one sense if Trump just ripped the whole thing up. But let's be also clear about this. There is moves afoot again to try to cripple the real Iranian currency. They're doing everything to destabilize Tehran, to cause regime change. Regime change is still on the table, and therefore, if anything happens in Iran, it's not a plot to do any good for Iran. It's not a plot that will do anything other than further the agenda of the cabal in the Middle East. I don't think for 1 minute regime change will happen. Iran will reform naturally, and there are grievances people have in the country, no doubt about it, and I think that will come about. But if we suddenly hear some of the Tehran government collapsing, that is extremely bad news for the West. It's extremely good news for the cabal. And so therefore this idea there's some grand convoluted plan involving the good guys, as people like to refer to them, exercising democracy in Iran, absolutely not the case. The collapse of Tehran will be very, very bad news. So I want to stress that point, because it's very, very clear that would be the case.
Yeah, I agree. Paul, switching gears real quick. You got the situation where Mario Draghi's coming out with his talking points, showing you how he does his funny math. So we have the ECB thing going on. The terminal patient known as Deutsche Bank is also coming out with some stats, which is also going to be deemed very interesting. So the whole European banking crisis is again back in the highlights. It never went away, but it's back in the highlights.
Yeah, well, Deutsche Bank has never gone away really, and yeah, they had this Q1 net revenue miss, the lowest analyst estimate. I think it was below the estimate of 7.3 billion euros. It came in at just below 7 billion. The sales and trading arm of the business fell by 17%, compared with an average 10% increase at the US banks. Now, it remains to be seen whether that 10% increase is reality, but it is in sharp contrast. And this resulted in about 75% collapse in pre-tax income. So the pre-tax income more than halved year on year to 430 million euros. They missed the average analyst expectation by almost a third. So the overall profits was 120 million euros. That's an 80% plunge year on year. Now they've got a new CEO, Christian Sewing, I think. Sewing, probably Sewing.
Yeah.
Now he's come out saying, these results aren't great, but the asset management business and the private and commercial banks doing well. Although we need to substantially improve profitability in both. So if you need to do that, it doesn't suggest they're doing that well. They've suggested that corporate and investment banks doing well in some areas, and they've held or gained market share in some certain areas. Well, I think that's questionable. There's a lot of suggestion that the investment banking arm is going to be severely curtailed. But the reality is they're just very weak in most business areas. And the idea they're going to have to act decisively and adjust strategy. Well, that's classic comments for a new CEO. Well, he's got to do that. That's the whole point. Can he actually achieve it? Probably unlikely. And of course they've got that big bloated derivatives book. I mean, who knows what it actually is in reality? It's just ridiculous. So Deutsche Bank staggers along as and there's always the idea. Well, if Deutsche Bank goes down, then it'll set a catalytic chain event in European banks that all end up spreading everywhere. Well, yes, there is that risk. So, yeah, Deutsche Bank's a very big millstone kind of round the European Union's neck. And in terms of ECB, well, as ever, there's now talk. Well, we'll never raise interest rates till 2019, which probably means it'll be 2020 or 21 or who knows. And they're not curtailing QE. Yeah, they're saying they're reducing it, but they're still having to pump the banking system. And then, of course, the ECB, and it's something I talked to CJ and he said to mention. We've discussed this. Was last October they recommended that banks write off bad loans after 7 years, and then the guidance was supposed to only apply to loans in the future. Which kind of like, well, what's the point in doing it with respect to loans in the future when you've got a major problem with bad loans in European banks? I think it's about roughly 760 billion euros across European banks that are bad, soured, dud, whatever loan you want to refer to. So it's an enormous problem. So why just go, well, we're only going to apply guidance in the future, but now, what they initially did, they came out with this tough idea that they could force banks to write down bad loans that clog up bank sheets. And they mentioned countries like Italy, Greece, Portugal, the usual suspects. But interestingly, they're having to back away from it because there was an enormous political backlash. And as effectively has forced them to ditch plans for stricter provisioning rules relating to these 760 billion, who knows, maybe €1 trillion of bad debt. And it's become a really embarrassment for the region's bank supervisors. Part of the reason they wanted to do it was to have this common Eurozone deposit insurance scheme, because Germany and other nations, Holland, etc., did rightfully say, well, we don't want all these risks on banks' balance sheets being that high. Because it could impact if we have this common insurance deposit scheme. Bear in mind then, if a bank goes down somewhere in Italy, it under that scheme, it's going to cause a huge amount of payouts. Arguably, who knows, depending how severe it is, it could go bust. But this enormous lobbying came from Italy. Well, unsurprisingly, because they've got about a quarter of all bad loans in the Eurozone. So these plans have all been watered down, and therefore, and I think it's finally a realization that, well, actually, do you know what? If we write all these bad loans down, it may require these poorly performing banks to have to be recapitalized. It may actually, in Italy's case, cause a contagion problem that then takes down France and takes down Germany and destroys the European Union. So the idea of implementing this policy is ridiculous anyway, given the state and the health of the banking system. I mean, if you only had a few bad loans in banks, implementing this would be a good policy. But when banks are endemically struggling with bad loans, and Italy being a great example of this, then trying to implement it is ridiculous. And now, of course, the ECB is backing off, going, well, we're considering further policies on these non-performing loans, but no decisions being made, and well, actually, we may hold off until the results of these pan-European stress tests. But by the way, they're not published till November, so it's the old classic ECB. I mean, they're the greatest for kicking the can down the road. I mean, Draghi is a great example of, we'll do everything it takes, to not resolve the problem. I mean, so again, it's just a classic example. The ECB is just paralyzed. It knows it can't raise interest rates, but it's the age-old thing. By not raising it, it wrecks the economy even more. By raising it, it wrecks the economy. Just look at what's happening in the US by raising interest rate, and therefore they're not, and they're never going to curtail QE till, well, who knows when. Eventually they'll stop it. So therefore it's just treading water, waiting for the inevitable to happen. And what else can it do? Nothing. I mean, it's power, and this is what zero interest rate policy does. And QE, if you employ it for more than a few months, it wrecks economies irreparably. There's nothing you can do. So, and rightly as well, lawmakers in the ECB said, well, we can't apply these rules to all banks. You've got to work on individual cases and assess banks on an individual basis. Absolutely. But the other question is, how are you going to, you can't reduce these bad loans. You can't and that was the other, they're trying to go, well, we'll just reduce it over a period of 2 years. Well, how do you assign what's a bad loan and what isn't a bad loan? It's just an utter farce, and shows that the idea the euros, I mean, look at the euro currency is being extremely strong against the pound and the dollar. That was one of the main reasons why the dollar index fell, was purely because of the euro. So there's all this idea of strength in the euro. Well, it's absolutely nonsense. It's just a basket case currency as well. And the ECB recent policy, and as you say, what Draghi comes out with on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, nothing's changed. It's just on life support and waiting for the inevitable to happen.
The contagion continues to spread. Paul, latest on Asia developments, anything going on with the New Silk Road and all the initiatives that are taking place over there?
I think it's just an ongoing thing. I mean, the estimate now in the end for the investment in the One Belt One Road is actually now coming in at $80 trillion equivalent.
Jeez, yeah, whoa. 80. You mean $80 trillion a year in business?
Yeah, well, no, the actual investment in terms of getting all the initiatives off the road. No, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, that's just in pure investment terms over the next, well, who knows how many years. I mean, the essential thing is that the move ultimately will be, we know what's going. I mean, we know what's been going on for the last 4 years, 3-4 years across the East. We've got all the sort of new energy pipelines coming on between China and Russia, which are well ahead of schedule, unsurprisingly. And nation after nation's queuing up to take advantage. There's been developments in Africa in terms of infrastructure and getting nations. I mean, just look at increasingly how the Russians and the Chinese have been visiting African continent to try and stimulate growth. I've said it before, that is a big growth sector. People keep saying to me it's never going to happen. It will. I would predict, and I've said it last week, but I'll say it again, at some point in the future, it could be a long time. Don't be surprised to see the African continent having a stronger economy than Europe, even, for example. I mean, potentially it has that capability. It could take many years to come to fruition. It might take decades, but at some point it will do, because there'll be massive investment coming in. The biggest problem you have in terms of the One Belt, One Road is, at the moment, it stops as it hits Europe effectively. I mean, there's some, I mean, you've got some, I mean, I think you have to be careful with the One Belt, One Road that we don't, forget things like the European Economic Union as well. These are all integral parts of it. So in that sense, you've got the Nord Stream 2, and there's talk maybe you'll even have a Nord Stream 3 coming online at some point in the future. We know Germany's going to rotate east and be part of this axis. I said many years ago, the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis, that is the backbone of the future economies. It's not dictatorial, it's not autocratic, it's none of these things, but that'll be the backbone of the One Belt, One Road. Unfortunately, that doesn't include nations like the UK and the US at this point. At some point, hopefully, common sense will prevail and these nations will join. But there's the trust aspect. We come back to that. Events in Syria has caused a huge damper in terms of trusting the UK, the US, France, for example. And that trust is going to have to be earned. But at some point they will. But the bandwagon just continues. We'll see. I think the gold markets I covered this off actually recently in a podcast where people say often to me, why don't you discuss gold? But when there's some significant developments, it's worth discussing it. Well, we've seen Turkey now basically effectively saying we're going to roll out the gold trade note, which we spoke about coming into fruition. There'll be gold exchanges popping up everywhere, which will be in direct competition to the COMEX and the LBMA, which will eventually the paper markets will disappear. And people say to me, why is gold and silver not moving? I never discuss the price of gold and silver. I'm not interested. The only time it gets interesting is when the paper market disappears. I keep hearing people talk about rallies in the price. Yeah, it goes up, and then 2 days later it gets smashed down. That will happen until the paper market eviscerates. When it does, then you'll see big changes in gold and silver prices, and absolutely undoubtedly. And really, in terms of economic development, just look at, people can Google all this information. There's tons of developments ongoing all the time in terms of Far Eastern nation, in terms of Africa, and the bandwagon just carries on. I mean, there's no point going into masses of detail and picking on anything in particular. But the thing is, the West still just doesn't buy it. They don't believe it. They just said, oh, China's taking advantage of nations. There's no investment opportunity. It's a pipe dream. They don't have the finance. They don't have the capability to do. Well, they do, and it's win-win for everyone. And the longer the West continues to ignore it, then the risks are to them just being left on the wayside increase. And it's as simple as that. I don't know how much convincing nations in the West need. I think Germany's very convinced. But as we've said, the big stumbling block in Europe's Merkel. Merkel's the one who's stopping the progress being made. I mean, yes, she's very weak now, and the coalition's not succeeding, and people are standing up to her on a repeated basis over international and domestic policy. It remains to be seen how much longer she'll stagger along in the coalition. But at some point, Germany is a natural ally of Russia, and always has been. And despite what the West says, it was the Russians who liberated Germany from the Nazis, and the Germans will always, hold Russia in high regard for that. And the truth is, if there was a war tomorrow involving Germany, the first nation who'd rush to their defense would be the Russians. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt.
I mean, that statement you just said is complete anathema to most American minds. Do you realize that? That's like like alien. Like when I tell the average American, no, it was actually the Russians that won World War II. They look at me with an incredulous look because everything has been propagandized. Everything's been propagandized. Where we think it's like we came in and we saved the whole world and this, that, and the other. it's remarkable where people's thinkings are because of their conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. I've been to both nations quite a few times, and they're just very natural allies. They work well together. I mean, there's thousands of Russian companies, well, German companies in Russia, and slightly less but significant Russian presence in Germany. I mean, they both have Germany's always synonymous with technology and engineering, and so is Russia. And I mean, they have great synergy between the two nations. And at some point, and it's the cabal's worst nightmare. And I think the very first time I ever spoke way back on live was to say, that's the cabal's biggest fear is when Germany rotates east, because they've lost control of Europe then in totality. Even though the progressive, they're getting weaker and weaker, because we're seeing nation after nation also, like Hungary and nations like that going, we've had enough and we want to work with the Chinese and the Russians, and so are other Eastern European nations. So the One Belt, One Road's chiseling away and making progress into Europe. And at some point, there'll be big, huge event will happen and the dam will break. And then the One Belt, One Road will suddenly advance quickly across Europe in that regard. But it's all event driven. And if you get hung up on dates, people are going to get, I keep saying this, but people will get very frustrated and very upset, because they'll think, well, I've been told something's supposed to happen on this day. It doesn't happen. Oh, therefore it's not going to happen. It's like the whole mass arrest thing. We spoke about this before we came on, and the idea that people would be adjudicated. Yes, things are going to happen. But, for the last year, I've had people saying to me, there's big things. It's going to happen this month. It's going to happen next month. No, it'll happen in the summer. It'll happen. And that's why I've never discussed it and never put dates on things, because I could have said all this and then I would have looked like an idiot, because people would have gone, well, hang on, you said this was going to happen. There is no dates. There is absolutely no dates attached to anything. It doesn't mean something can't happen tomorrow or next week. Yes, it could. In terms of adjudicating people, there's processes on individual people that may have made more progress for some people than others. But there's not this idea that there's 300 people or 1,000 people and they're all going to be adjudicated on the same day and there's a whole process. It can't work like that. The legal system doesn't work like that. Okay, people say, well, the Nuremberg trials were like that, but that's not the situation we're in. People will have to be individually adjudicated for things they've been involved in. The amount of evidence that has to be sifted and to make cases watertight, just because we all know certain people are, culpable and guilty for multiple crimes against humanity, doesn't mean anything unless it sticks legally and we have that process in place. So yes, things will happen, but don't expect things to happen today, tomorrow. Yeah, things may happen, but that doesn't mean anything either, because it's the age-old thing. A broken clock's right twice a day. It doesn't mean when someone gets the time right, they're always correct. And this isn't about saying, well, I said this on a certain date and now it's happening. But there is a process. It will happen. But don't get frustrated when things don't happen. I get people getting in touch saying, oh, big things are going to happen in March. I said, I'm not aware of anything big happening in March. March came and went and nothing major happened. And now we're in April, and I keep getting people saying the same things to me. Oh, big things are going to happen in April. Well, yeah, they might happen. But if they don't get frustrated. It doesn't matter. Eventually, things will come to pass, but it's a huge process. I mean, the process of resetting the whole world with the cabal's been going on for decades. It's not just a recent phenomenon that happened in the last few years because China decided to launch the One Belt, One Road, and Russia got fed up with what was happening in Ukraine. Yet that was a big tipping point that made a lot of events happen quickly. But it's like Syria. Syria was a huge event. Putin's speech on the 1st of March to lawmakers, as we said, is a huge catalytic event. We've seen countless things happen since then. And Syria is a great example. It was a catalytic event that's going to have consequences. We're seeing the OPCW comment today. That is a huge, huge milestone. It's a huge acknowledgement of the reality of what's going on. This permeates around the world. It permeates into the mindset of people to understand, well, hang on, maybe I'm not being told the truth about things. So there are huge consequences for actions, but it is event driven. There's never any time. So if we get to the, there's things supposed to be major things happening in April. Well, if they happen, great. But if they don't, it doesn't matter. Don't get frustrated. They may not happen till June. They may happen in August. They may not happen till next year. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And I think people get frustrated because they think, well, I'm being led to believe all these things are supposed to happen, and if they don't, they'll just get crushed and feel nothing's going to happen.
Right.
It's the age-old thing. Trump is not cabal. He never has been and never was and never will be. But he'll make mistakes because he's not a president. He, in a sense, he's frankly, he could have just had a nice, easy life. But he's not a president in the sense of being a politician. He's a businessman. He doesn't think like a politician, and in a way, that's great. But it makes it difficult for him to do the job when he's having to deal with politicians and people and understand how that world works. It's like the tariffs. You can't treat it as a business deal. That's what he's done, and that's a mistake, and he shouldn't continue doing that. But that doesn't mean he's a bad guy and he's doing things. He's just making mistakes. And under the pressure he's under and what he's had to deal with, there's an inevitability that mistakes will get made. But hopefully there's enough people around him who can give him the right guidance and help him understand the minefield. And the other thing, of course, is every time Trump moved somewhere and tried to do something, it just sets a load of alarms off through the cabal system. And then all these alarms go off everywhere, and everyone's aware, oh, hang on, this means this, because that's how that system works. And they're aware of things. So it is a difficult job. Yeah. I mean, yeah, regrettably, he's made mistakes. He should never have gone into Syria and done what he did. But mistakes will be made. But in terms of the whole arrest thing, yeah, there is undoubtedly thousands of sealed indictments. I don't doubt who that relates to. Nobody knows specifically. But at some point, in the grand order of how the world's going to evolve and change, then people will have to take responsibility for their actions, and things will happen. And yeah, there are certain. Recently, we've seen some interesting developments in terms of, things like the texts that were supposed to be with Strzok and Page, and they were supposed to be available to, are now going to be assessed. The FBI has handed them over, or whoever was responsible. Yeah, they're all interesting. They're all interesting developments. But it doesn't mean that just because that then gets released, suddenly 5 minutes later, a whole bunch of people are going to be adjudicated. The legal process doesn't work like that. It takes months and years for things to come to pass. And that's just an unfortunate reality. And it should be that way. We can't say, well, we're going to have a just, fair, and new world, and then go, well, by the way, with respect to you, we're just going to throw the book away and just do whatever we want. No, because you can't do that. You have to do things correctly and make sure if people should be adjudicated, they are. And due process then finds them guilty if they are guilty. And that way you've shown the world we're doing things in the correct way. We're not having kangaroo courts and deciding that someone's guilty just because we think they are. Otherwise, we're no better than the very lunatics who've ran this world and done precisely that in different ways to humanity. We have to show we're different, and we intend to do things the right way in the future.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for being on, man. It's the end of the program. Why don't you again give out the website and if any social media, how people can follow you?
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously the website's the SiriusReport.com, SIRIUS. There's all free material on there, and people are welcome to go and visit. We definitely like you to subscribe to, it is $4.75 a month. We've kind of changed the format a bit recently, and people really like it, so I'm pleased, and thanks for all the feedback. People said it's kind of a little bit easier to listen to. It's kind of more like what we're doing now in terms of how we're speaking. I've changed that, even though it's a bit strange to speak to yourself effectively in that regard, but that's worked out well. But it does, and people like it, and I appreciate the feedback, and we're always welcome to people's views and how they think things should be done differently. So yeah, we'd like you to subscribe. Go to the website; it's on the front page, and we'd appreciate that. Yeah, we've got the Facebook group, although increasingly we don't really tend to use it, not because of what's happened with Facebook. It just seems like no one really is interested in Facebook.
from
our perspective. No, and then Twitter, we've had quite a number of new followers, and we've got quite a big traffic now going through it in terms of people reading tweets and responding. So that's proven to be a useful medium for us to utilize. But no, thanks for everyone who has subscribed, and as usual, we always thank Rogue Money, because that really changed our audience, and we got a much bigger sort of audience as a result of coming on Rogue Money, and we went on X22, etc., etc. So we're always very grateful, and it's always a pleasure to be on.
And with that being said, folks, we're over and out. Take it away, CJ.